So now we're going to launch right into a deep dive into each of the cognitive functions. And we're going to start out with extroverted intuition first. So this session is going to be a deep dive into the cognitive function process of extroverted intuition. And what's great about this, and why I like to start with it, it kind of warms me up, is that this is my driver process. This is my dominant function. And it's the dominant function of approximately, well, the dominant and auxiliary function of approximately 15% of the population. So 15% of the population is using exploration or extroverted intuition as either their driver or co-pilot, or what's technically called their dominant or auxiliary process. Now, as we mentioned in the overview, exploration is pattern recognizing, right? Advanced pattern recognition, that's how it likes to learn. Information gathering, right? It's non-judgmental, it doesn't prejudge, it just gathers information, and it's an outer world function or outside world function, so it's extroverted. And the fact that it's a perceiving function means that it's going to enjoy and love learning, all right? Anybody who's using this as a driver process is going to favor learning over anything else. However, those who use it as their auxiliary process are going to, when they learn, they're going to prefer or favor learning in the exploration way over all others. Now, it is a driver or dominant function in the ENTP and the ENFP type. Those are the two types who have it as their dominant process. And it's going to be a co-pilot or auxiliary function for INTPs and INFP. So if you notice, all NPs in the Myers-Briggs dichotomies, four-letter dichotomy system, all NPs use extroverted intuition. If you're an ENP, you're using it as your driver. If you're an INP, you're using it as your co-pilot. Now, it's also going to be represented in the cars of people who have it as a weakness or as a tertiary and inferior process, or in the car model, the 10-year-old and 3-year-old process. And so those who have it as a 10-year-old process or tertiary are ESTJs and ESFJs. It's going to be in that position of the conscious incompetent, or the 10-year-old position. It's not going to be strength for them, but it's going to be conscious. Remember, anything to the right of the car falls in that conscious category. So it's going to be conscious for them, but it's not going to be something that they automatically go to when they're using it in a good way. And as a 3-year-old process, it's for, this is a 3-year-old or inferior for ISTJs and ISFJs. So if you notice, all the NPs are using it as their way of learning, and all the SJs will have it in some form of weakness, either the 10-year-old or the 3-year-old. And as I mentioned, it's a dominant or auxiliary process. So NPs make up approximately 15% of the population, which when you consider 4 different types, 4 types out of 16, if it was all evenly across the board, that would be 25%. But they're not 25% of the population. They're only 15% of the population. So this is a less represented type in the general overall population. All right, so what do we know about exploration or extroverted intuition? Well, people who use this is their mindset. They see the world as a spider web of ideas or data points. As we mentioned in the overview, it's about collecting information in real time using advanced pattern recognition. So seeing patterns where other people miss information, or they miss the information. Seeing bigger pictures, zooming out, taking in more territory to be able to understand how 2 things connect where other people might miss that connection. In fact, one of the best ways to understand how exploration or extroverted intuition works is by understanding this massive zoom out process. If you can take an aerial view and look down on your terrain, you can see how things connect where other people who are in it, right, they're not zoomed out, they're right there invested, they'll miss it because this piece of information might be right by them, but this other piece might be completely out of their peripheral. They don't even see it. However, when you zoom out, right, and take in a bigger terrain, now you see these 2 pieces of information and you can see how these 2 pieces of information, and you can see how they might connect with each other, whereas somebody in the experience might be missing it. So it's very conceptual, it's very zoom out. It's taking an aerial view. You'll hear people talk about taking a 20,000-foot view. They're using exploration generally to do that. And because you're zoomed out and you're seeing this big picture and you're seeing how all these pieces of information, disparate pieces of information are connecting, you're seeing emerging patterns. Now, the difference between a pattern and an emerging pattern is that a pattern is already there and an emerging pattern is something new. And that's why exploration people mess with their environment. They're trying to create different situations, different influencers, different controls. They're trying to mess with their environment to see if a new pattern will emerge, something that is novel, something that hasn't been seen before. And if they do enough messing around with their environment, eventually something that is completely new will come up. And that's what they're looking for. They love emergent patterns. Emergent means something that is the inevitable result of a system that is running. Okay, so that's what emergent means. It means that this system is running and it's going to only have one outcome, right, as long as the system is running. But if an exploration person goes in and like removes this part of the system or influences this piece, now the system changes, and now as the system is changing, the emergent's going to change as well. And so now we see a new pattern form. We see us influencing the system in a different way and getting a new result. Exploration loves that more than anything else. Messing with the system in order to get a new result is one of their most satisfying things. And that's why they oftentimes look cavalier. They look devil-may-care. They look like they're messing around with everything. And it's because they are messing around with everything. They love to see how something new will come from something that everybody else assumes only has one emergent. They are very optimistic and fall in love with ideas and concepts. One of my favorite quotes from an exploration person is from Jim Carrey, who said, "I feel sorry for anyone in a relationship with me when I'm making love to one of my ideas." Oh, that is such a fantastic exploration quote. Now, perspectives people might understand that a little bit too, but it's really exploration people who so focus on their ideas and concepts, these new ideas and concepts, that they'll sometimes completely forget the people that they're in relationships with. As a primary function, exploration is fearless to explore and driven to experiment. That feedback loop, that feedback that comes back to you when you're messing with the environment, that's the reward. That is the one thing you're focused on. You love that more than anything, and sometimes you'll do anything to get it. Feedback becomes something you get obsessed with because feedback tells you what is new and a new emergent in a pattern. So feedback you become hyper-focused on. Feedback from the environment. How are things changing? How are they staying the same? Very important. People who are exploration experience life specifically to understand and make new connections. So oftentimes exploration people look different than everyone else because they don't want to show up the same way. They want to show up unique. They want to show up different. They want to show up in a way that puts a piece of wood in the spoke, right? They want to mess with things, and if they show up in a novel, unique way, oftentimes they'll get novel, unique emergence from the environment or novel, unique feedback from the environment. When I say they're fearless to explore, when I mentioned in the overview that I think of exploration people as having 6-foot-tall grass in front of them and a machete in their hand, and they've got to blaze a trail. This is how exploration thinks. They want to be blazing new trails. They want to be going where no man has gone before. That is one of the most interesting things that they can do. So they can either do this in a physical, adventurous way, think of it in sort of Indiana Jones terms, or they can be doing this in a conceptual way. They can blaze new conceptual trails and figure out things that nobody's figured out on a conceptual level. So concepts, new ideas, brainstorming sessions, all of this is the crack cocaine of the exploration type. And what's interesting about them, and this is the thing that's confusing to other types, even if they get what I've just talked about, exploration will continue experimenting after they've achieved success. All right, because it wasn't success that they were looking for. They weren't effectiveness. They weren't looking for an end game goal. Even if they've gotten success, they will continue to experiment because the experimenting is the fun thing, right? Now, sometimes they'll go, yes, I've achieved, and they'll do things like create patents and trying to get it implemented into society. But the second that is a part of infrastructure now, as soon as their idea has now been adopted into society, they are on to something else. Or they might even try a new thing based on what they've just created. Think of the most innovative companies that have been around for the last 20 or 30 years. They don't stop with one good thing. They keep innovating. They keep pushing the envelope and trying to create something new. And that's very much an exploration mindset. Now, when it is in the wild, if you want to know how to spot it in the wild, if it's a driver process, then oftentimes you're looking for somebody who has a fair degree of charisma. Charisma is a way to mess with the environment, but not have villages chasing you with torches and pitchforks, all right? So this is an important thing that exploration needs to develop over time, because they need to make sure that as they're messing with the environment isn't trying to attack them. Right? And so they have to be able to talk their way out of sticky situations, and they've done that enough times over the course of their life, right? They've messed everything up, and now they got to think quick, and now they got to talk themselves out of the situation. That generally charisma is a skill that they develop. Now, charisma is important because it's not only to talk yourself out of hot water, but it's also a way to sell your ideas to others. So charisma becomes a strategy that honors the process. Charisma is a strategy that honors the mental process. And then on top of that, they're oftentimes charismatic because they show up new, and people find new things, not always, not everybody, but frequently we get tired of the stale. And when somebody shows up with a completely novel new way of going at life, we appreciate that on some core level. Even if we find that individual kind of obnoxious, we still appreciate the fact that they're bringing something new to the world and spicing up life. So charisma is oftentimes a marker as the driver function of exploration. Now, as I mentioned, charisma is the way to talk yourself out of the pitchforks and the torches. However, you will, if you're an exploration driver, you will put yourself in awkward situations knowingly. You will knowingly interject yourself into an awkward situation or create an awkward situation. And that means a lot of times, or what that looks like a lot of times, is breaking rules. All right, so exploration people don't have a lot of respect for rules that don't make sense to them. They might obey rules if it suits them, and if it doesn't suit them, if it doesn't make sense, then they'll be cavalier and have no problem breaking the rule. So rules are not intrinsically important to exploration. Rules are there. Oftentimes they'll say rules are meant for other people, right? To create order in other people who are less responsible than them, or maybe are boring or whatever. But rules are not that important to exploration, unless, of course, it's something to effectively protect human rights. Usually they are procrastinators, and they'll pull rabbits out of hats in the 11th hour. It is not uncommon for me to be writing content while I'm creating a program. That doesn't necessarily mean that I've procrastinated. It's that the energy that comes to me in the 11th hour is unlike any other energy. So it's not even so much about procrastination as it is about utilizing the energy and the emergence that come out of a program that help me understand which thing I should be talking about. It's not uncommon for exploration people to say that they learn through performance. They have to be in motion in order to figure out which direction to go. I hear a lot of exploration people say that they don't know the right answer, they don't know the right decision to make until they've already made a decision, right? And then they'll know whether or not it was the right one. And so that being in performance and being in motion is usually the best way to calibrate which direction to go. It's not unusual for an exploration person to make a decision and then completely 180 that decision. They oftentimes work in spurts, and they're susceptible to burnout. Nardi said that when he was hooking people up to the EEG machines and watching extroverted intuition in ENPs, he noticed that it was the most difficult of all of the processes to get into flow. That's interesting, isn't it? It's the most difficult of all the 8 processes to get into flow. But when it burns hot and it burns intense. And so what you'll see in exploration people is a workaholic mentality for a certain amount of time, and then they'll just drop. So it's a lot of sprints, it's a lot of fits and starts, it's a lot of working in spurts and then burning out. It runs really hot. Difficult to get there. Once it's there, it is on fire. They have a casual but confident body language usually. They oftentimes come across like they're very comfortable in their environment. They're very familiar in their environment. And because they put themselves in hot water a lot, they've gotten pretty good at figuring out how to navigate the terrain to get them out of hot water. So they have kind of a casual body language. They feel comfortable in the environment. They feel comfortable about their ability to be improvisational, and they feel comfortable being spontaneous. They love verbal quips. They'll engage in banter easily. They really enjoy banter. Banter is sort of the sport of that gets them out of boredom a lot, because exploration is looking for new things. Anytime they have to engage in the mundane is a chore, and so oftentimes banter is the way to make a chore enjoyable. And they're a mix of activity and cerebral behavior. So they're not quite as kinesthetic as sensation people. They're in the moment. They're real time. Remember, we talked about the difference between real time kinetic and post processing. They're real time for sure. And they have a combination of that physical activity plus a cerebral quality, which is why I think they like the verbal quips more than something that would be, say, an adrenaline rush. And oftentimes they're optimistic. I mentioned that a couple different times. That what if possibilities thinking, that oftentimes ends up having them think in terms of what if all the way around, no matter what they're referring to. So I've seen exploration people get into relationships with somebody based on who that person could be, who they see them as, in the sense of I'm interacting with you now, you're at this level of development, but I could totally see you here. I know what you look like if you were to be at this level. So they'll get in a relationship with a person based on them being able to see them at this level, and then get very disillusioned when the person stays at this level, right? They got in the relationship with them based on the what if of the best version of that person. And then they get really frustrated. Well, that's a part of their almost invariably optimistic demeanor. And of course, we're talking about exploration as a driver process. So these are ENTPs and ENFPs. And the optimism oftentimes gets them through really interesting situations, right? It's a part of that charisma. It helps them see what ifs in like the big picture. It helps them become inventive, but it can also trip them up in a relationship setting when they're not being realistic about what that relationship looks like. They can often be an instigator in a group. I'm sure you're shocked by that. They can often prod people into doing things that the other person might not think is a good idea. And of course, what are they doing? They're messing with their environment. They're trying to get the system to have different influencers to see different patterns emerge. They can be unintentionally or sometimes intentionally cruel when pushing people's buttons socially. So exploration can be marked by somebody who has a bit of a callous attitude toward other people, because again, what are they looking for? They're not looking for harmony. They're not looking to get a goal met. They're looking for a novel, emergent pattern. And sometimes messing with people is the way to get to that novel, emergent pattern. So sometimes they can be unintentionally or even sometimes intentionally cruel. And we'll talk about it in just a moment. But that's why it's so imperative for them to develop the co-pilot process of either authenticity or accuracy to make sure that that's something that resonates with them. If they're going to be cruel, it usually means that they're not checking in internally very much. They're not asking themselves if they think that that's the right thing to do. And oftentimes, if an exploration person is a cruel person, it means that they've shut off the co-pilot process and they're going straight to their 10-year-old to make decisions. They may take completely irrational actions in search of feedback. Again, feedback, feedback, feedback. If you want to know if somebody is exploration, see the relationship with feedback. If they're always looking for the environment to tell them what's going on, if they're always looking for new, novel, what-if feedback emergence, you're probably dealing with an exploration person. Sometimes they're unfairly diagnosed as ADD. Now, that's not to say that ADD is always unfairly diagnosed, and that's not to say that all exploration people will be diagnosed as ADD. However, it seems to be some pattern because they learn by pushing buttons, not by sitting in a rote situation. So they want things that are catching their conceptual mind. They want things that are interesting. If they have to learn through rote memorization, oftentimes they'll get bored. And if they get too bored, then sometimes they'll become class clowns, or they'll start messing with their environment and looking for those emergents, and they can be called attention deficit if the subject is not intriguing their exploration process. And they can be surprisingly easy to influence if they're too outwardly focused and don't cultivate enough introverted judgment. And that's another piece of what happens when they ignore their co-pilot process. If they ignore authenticity and accuracy too much, two things happen. Number one, they're either jerks, right? And they're messing with their environment in a way that actually is not ethical for them. Or they can be way too open to suggestion because they're not checking in with themselves and figuring out what's right for them. So they're just very easily influenced. They'll say yes to anything. They're always chasing opportunities. And if somebody makes any sort of suggestion feedback-wise, remember they love feedback, so sometimes they overvalue feedback. And when they overvalue that feedback and they don't check in with themselves to see how they feel about it, then they can be very easy to get discouraged or to be influenced to do something that's not right for them. All right, what about if exploration is the co-pilot? Well, if it's a co-pilot process, now remember, this would be INTPs and INFPs, and these are introverts, okay? They're leading with a different process. They're going to lead with either authenticity or accuracy, which we'll get to in a later session. So exploration would be their co-pilot process. And this shows up as generally because they lead with introversion, and this is their auxiliary or co-pilot, it means that they're still going to like pushing buttons, but it's generally going to be a lot quieter. They're going to show up in a more thoughtful way, and their pushing buttons is going to be a lot more subtle. You'll see it in a less expressive way. They're still counterculture to some extent. They still really prefer the new emergence over what has already been established, but they'll do it in a more conceptual way as opposed to they'll do it in less of a button pushing way. They like pushing buttons, but they're going to be less obnoxious about it usually. And so they'll make connections, maybe not in the physical realms as much as they will in the conceptual realm. And one great example of this would be Einstein, who was an INTP. His theory of relativity, he made major connections between known scientific concepts, but he was also thinking way outside the box, all right? And at the time, basically an entire generation of physicists had to die before they would accept Einstein's theories. And that's in the scientific realm. So exploration generally just kind of gets used to this idea that their concepts may or may not be adopted in their lifetime because they're so outside of the norm. But they don't let that stop them. And frequently, true brilliance comes from that connection that they've made that is counter to what everybody expects. Now, the INFP version of this is this idea of deciding what is right and wrong. Remember, INFPs lead with authenticity, and when we went over our quick sort of overview of the types, authenticity was the type that was very interested in implications of ethics, good and evil, how they feel what's authentic for them. Frequently, when they marry that with exploration, they're not bound to the same social precedents. They're looking for new ways of thinking in terms of good and evil or determining that. And frequently, they end up quite philosophical. They also end up very artistic because they're looking for new novel ways to implement that. Remember, we were talking about the emotional replication of authenticity. We mentioned that in the overview. Authenticity likes to emotionally replicate in other people and experience so that that helps them get in touch with their emotional experience, the individuals, that is the audience. Well, they'll find novel new ways to do that. And that's not uncommon for INFPs to become either philosophers or artists of some sort. All right, as a weakness, how do we spot this in the wild as a weakness? So as a profiler, one of the ways that you're going to determine type is to figure out what the backseat passengers are. And for SJs, sensor judgers, this will be a backseat passenger. And it will look very interesting. If it's a tertiary or a 10-year-old, it's going to be way more conscious and show up more obvious. If it's an inferior or a 3-year-old, it's going to be way more subtle. But there are certain markers of exploration being a 10-year-old or a 3-year-old. And that is impulsive actions and a wild phase when younger. Now, this is less so with ISTJs and ISFJs, although they will have a wild side to them that they never, ever, ever they'll contextualize it, and I'll mention that in a moment. I'll say how they contextualize it in just a second. But for ESTJs and ESFJs, this is way more on their conscious radar because it's their 10-year-old, so it's in the conscious side of the car. And this will usually be like, I went through a wild phase when I was in my teens, or I was a kind of a wild child, and then I grew up and I got, a steady job, etc. But that wild part of them is always there. It also shows up when they're making guesses or speculating about what's going on with other people's behavior in order to support a judgment. Now, this would be how the driver and the 10-year-old go into cahoots with each other with ESTJs and ESFJs. The driver process will come to a conclusion. For an ESTJ or an ESFJ, this is going to be an extroverted judging process, right? It's going to be either effectiveness or harmony. And one of the pitfalls of the extroverted judging processes is that they believe they know what's right for people in the outer world, right? They're making judgment about the outer world. And when they decide something is right or wrong in the outer world, when they're judging somebody else, but they don't want to go inside to say, but what would I do in that situation? Can I sympathize? Can I kind of understand that other person's perspective? Have I ever experienced anything like that in the past myself? Instead of going inward to calibrate their judgment, they'll go to exploration as the 10-year-old to make a speculation that supports that conclusion, right? So exploration will go, well, who knows what's going on in that house, right? Like it's all conspiratorial. And that's how the ESTJ or ESFJ will inappropriately utilize the 10-year-old of exploration to support something they already have judged. Now, for an inferior process, for ISTJs and ISFJs, this is them focusing on nightmare scenarios, right? Like the what ifs. This is the ISTJ or the ISFJ that won't fly in a plane, right? Like they'll get in a car, right, which is about 100 times more dangerous, but they won't fly in a plane because what if it came down? So when you've got all of these possible nightmare worst case scenarios, when you've got those going on for you, that's generally, as an ISTJ or an ISFJ, that's usually you going to your inferior process and speculating, but at a very embryonic level. Now, when I said that ISTJs and ISFJs will oftentimes have a little bit of that wild side to them, but they don't let on, if they can contextualize it in a situation that they think is appropriate or socially appropriate, then they'll go to the exploration process. So something like, I think one of the most classic examples of this I read in David Kiersey's book, Please Understand Me, where he talked about ISTJs feeling like it's okay to let their hair down at like a male ISTJ at a stag party, right? Like it's okay to have like, strippers and drink too much alcohol because this society has to some level put the rubber stamp on that context as being the time when you get wild, or going to Vegas, right? And like what happens at Vegas stays at Vegas. These are contextualized situations where exploration is considered okay or even appropriate. So that's generally where an ISTJ or an ISFJ will allow themselves to go to that childlike exploration place and go a little wild. However, if they don't have a context or a container where they feel safe doing it, right? They lead with memory, and memory wants to feel reliable and safe. Then if they don't have a container, then generally when they go to their inferior process, it looks really messy. If you have an ISTJ or an ISFJ going to their 3-year-old process, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we go over each of the 16 types. If they go to their 3-year-old or inferior process, it oftentimes will look like a very uncharacteristic impulsive move. Like they'll run off and get married to somebody they just met, kind of impulsive. And usually that's a sign that they're very unhappy in their current life, that their driver process is not getting the attention it needs, or it's overtaxed. And then they go to the exploration process in order to try to, stab at the wall or throw spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. And so exploration becomes this uncharacteristic, wild, impulsive action that they generally regret. All right, so those are the ways that you're going to see exploration in the wild in all of the different positions, as the driver, the co-pilot, the 10-year-old, and the 3-year-old. But just remember, the important thing to remember is that exploration is about new, novel, and possibilities thinking. Anytime somebody is speculating on what if, right, could we get to the moon? What's going on in that house? Anytime you've got somebody who's trying to see an emergent pattern, that's them using the exploration process. And depending upon where it falls in their car, it's going to dictate how good they are at using it. An ENTP or an ENFP, they're going to be hands down the best at using exploration. Hands down, right? Because this is the process that they love using. So they're exercising it. It's a joy to exercise all the time. For an INTP and an INFP, this is going to be their growth. The more they can utilize this process, the better they become as an individual holistically. So this is really massively, high leverage for growth. When you're profiling somebody, those are the markers you're looking for. So even if they're an introvert, if you see this sort of like, well, I don't care what society thinks, if you see this coming up over and over as a theme, you might be dealing with an INTP or an INFP. And then, of course, when you're profiling and you believe you have somebody who could be an SJ, feel free to, once you get to a point where you really feel confident, go into that murky territory of the 10-year-old and 3-year-old and ask questions about what happens when they're not at their best. When you feel like you're not at your best, do you have a tendency to speculate, judgmentally? Do you have a tendency to do impulsive actions? My aunt is an ISFJ, and when she's feeling really depressed, she will paint a wall in her house a brand new bright color. So exploration, right? A new thing, novel, something new to her, but in a safe container of her home. So those are the kinds of markers that you're looking for. Something new and novel to the person, but in a safe container when it's an SJ that's expressing it. All right, so that's the deep dive into exploration. And what we're going to do next in the next session is we're going to do a deep dive into the other intuitive process of perspectives.
Here's the exercise for session number 9. This is your exploration or any exercise. Choose one mundane activity that you do every day. Putting on shoes, brushing your teeth, driving to work, whatever is something that you do literally every day. Now try 5 different, completely new ways of doing that activity. Don't choose 5 ways that you know will work out great. Choose 5 new ways, some which may work and others which may not. This is not to confirm a suspicion. This is not to try to leverage or make something necessarily better out of the gate that you already know will be great. But this is to see what you can learn from doing something outrageous, completely different. When people use this as a dominant or as an auxiliary process, when they use extroverted intuition, it's about watching emerging patterns. It's not about confirming suspicions. Somebody who uses this all the time wouldn't think, oh, I bet I can make it better if, when they're using it as a child. They just think, what would happen if? It's not necessarily about leveraging at the get-go. So if you choose to do an activity like brushing your teeth, then decide to do something crazy like putting the toothpaste directly on your teeth. Don't do things that you know will work out. Do things that are completely outside of your frame, if possible. The point is to allow yourself to get outside your comfort zone. And then while you're doing it, remember, you're trying to get into the mind space of people who use this process all the time. So what does it teach you about people who use this process as a dominant or an auxiliary function? What does it tell you about them? What does it help you understand about people who are literally vetting everything in the world through these processes or through this process? So 5 mundane activities done completely different. And then, of course, report your findings. Tell us what you did. What was the mundane activity? What were the 5 different ways that you chose to do it? And what emerging patterns did you learn? And then what did it teach you about people who use this process?